Welcome back to the channel, everybody. So, as the world continues to spiral towards insanity and expanded geopolitical conflict, and the United States has a presidential election about a week away that's poised to be probably one of the most impactful ones in U.S. history, we've got to talk about some unfortunate potential realities that we may have to, unfortunately, look at going forward here in the United States, okay? Now, and we've talked about this a few times on the channel, but this is gonna be a little bit different video. And that is the potential and probably very likely upcoming U.S. military draft in probably the next couple years, all right? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna talk a little bit about the likelihood of that happening based off of how things look today. Also, I've got other videos on this if you're interested in it that go more deep into this. Right, and then we're going to talk about, because again, this video is going to be about on how you or your children can avoid the military draft if it comes. Okay, first thing we got to talk about after the likelihood is the misconceptions on people who seem to think the way they can get out of the draft and in America. There's a lot of them based off the comments and all the other videos that yeah, it's not a thing. And then we'll talk about the actual ways that you can avoid the draft. And there's quite a few that people don't know and don't actually really think about. Okay, so yeah, this is, you know, a lot of people have said, you know, 3-4 months ago when I did this first video on military draft, being potential, everybody, you know, not everybody, but a lot of people said, oh, you're a fearmonger, and war in the Middle East will never break back out, and the war in Russia and Ukraine is dying down. 3-4 months later, all those conflicts have spiraled to their highest levels of elevation yet, okay? And there's no signs that they're slowing down, and as we've seen recently in some of the videos I've done, the United States is starting to get more and more directly involved in both of those conflicts, okay? So, yeah, what's the likelihood, okay? So, just strictly speaking, it's going to be highly dependent on this next election, okay? I'm not going to get into what that means either way. I'm sure you guys have brains in your head. You can figure that out. But it will be, you know, I think it's a reality that the next, basically, I don't know what day it is today, maybe 6-7 days, the world is never going to be the same one way or another after this next election, for good or for bad. Things are going to change. Things are going to be wildly different going forward. And the likelihood of a draft is actually, I think, incredibly likely based off of everything that's happening in the world. I would say within 4 years, I could see it being, you know, a minimum of 50% chance. I know it's super high, but I'll kind of explain why here. So, the biggest thing you need to realize about the military draft, and I see this all the time in the comment sections, about how the draft would never happen in 2024 and society wouldn't allow it and all these things. Guys, human beings are not different. Societies are not different. The draft, you need to understand this. The military drafts, and this is worldwide, just not in America, the draft is the norm, not the exception, okay? So everybody who's a millennial and below seems to think, especially Gen Z, that because they didn't see a draft in their lifetime or global war on terror, even though we almost had one, we'll talk about that in a second, that it just will never happen, okay? That is some incredibly naive, ignorant, head-in-the-sand way to look at things, okay? You need to prepare yourself for potential realities, and that's what this video is about, okay? And again, what do I mean by it's the norm and not the exception? Okay, well, let's set global war on terror to the side for a moment, even though we were that close to having the draft. Okay, what conflicts has the United States or wars used military draft in? All of them, for the most part, okay? People were drafted in Vietnam, the Korean War, World War II, World War I, the Civil War on both the Union and the Confederates, the Revolutionary War, okay? The global war on terror and Desert Storm, basically the only ones, for the most part, that we didn't have a draft. And again, global war on terror was supposed to have a draft, but it happened when they needed it. It was during an election year, and it would have been political suicide. But they still did do stop-loss recalls, which is that close to having a draft, okay? So had the global war on terror had a draft, it would have just been every single conflict and war. And to think that America is not going to get into another major conflict and war, God bless your little hearts if you think that. I love the delusion fantasy land that you guys live in if you actually think that, okay? We are going to find another war to get into, and we are posturing to do it right now based off the way our inflammatory leadership and people in charge are talking. Okay, so the biggest problem, and why I think it's so likely, is the military's recruitment and retention is extremely weak right now, okay? Our manning, our actual numbers for soldiers, we are not meeting quotas, and we are not meeting quotas by tens of thousands of soldiers every year. I think we missed by about 42,000 last year. I'm sure we're poised to miss by at least those numbers again. Those are compounding, and those are big problems, okay? You need a lot of people to fight wars, okay? And not every war is going to be as simple, especially the next big one, as fighting an insurgency in Afghanistan, where you don't need as many troops and special operations can handle a bulk of the load, or Desert Storm, which is a pretty fast, quick, Iraq's military couldn't handle ours type of situation. When you're talking about war in Ukraine and Russia, peer-to-peer, as you can see there, hundreds of thousands of soldiers have died on both sides. If America were getting engaged in a conflict like that, we do not have the soldiers to go and fight that war. We do not have the soldiers at the moment to go fight a war just in Iran, okay? So if we get into a direct conflict that is large, there will be a draft. That's because retention and recruitment is so bad. The only reason that we managed to skate the draft in the global war on terror is because following 9/11, patriotism was so high, okay, that so many of that young generation, my young generation, wanted to join the military, wanted to serve, that there was actually enough soldiers to go fight. We don't have that anymore. That's gone, okay? So how do you remedy that? You force people to join. And we are dangerously close to getting to that now. Even Sergeant Major of the Army, I've showed this clip before, has specifically stated, and I'll show the clip again real quick, that the Army has to grow. It has to get exponentially bigger to get ready for the next major conflict. So let's check that clip out right now.
The truth, though, is we need those numbers to be higher in the upcoming years because we actually need to grow the Army based off that global environment we talked about at the very beginning, right? And so this isn't, you know, time for balloons and streamers and celebration.
Okay, like he said, you know, with rising, and he said this, I think, a month or two ago before, you know, things were starting to spiral out of control, but rising geopolitical conflict is going to need the Army to grow. The Army is not growing right now. The Army is going this way. So how are you going to grow an Army that can't retain or recruit people? You force them to join, okay? So, again, and we, you know, you can see the military-industrial complex is salivating right now, especially with what's going on in Israel and Iran, and for whatever reason, the establishment wants that conflict to happen, right? And I'll show you a clip of the current administration saying it themselves right here. So check this out.
Which foreign country do you consider to be our greatest adversary?
I think there's an obvious one in mind, which is Iran. Iran has American blood on their hands, okay? This attack on Israel, 200 ballistic missiles. What we need to do to ensure that Iran never achieves the ability to be a nuclear power, that is one of my highest priorities.
So
there you go. Iran is the biggest threat ever to America, okay? It's silly, but it's a good way to sort of posture and get the saber rattling going so that potentially, again, depends on who wins, you know, we can start beating the drums for Israel and head into that conflict, and here we go again, right? So next thing we need to do before we get into this is go over the misconceptions, okay? So because you know, in the comment section, thousands of comments on those videos about how people plan on avoiding the draft that are not a thing. Okay, so let's go over those. So you can just be, you can be sure that it's not going to work for you. Okay, the first one, I saw this, probably hundreds of these. I won't let the government take my children and send them to war. You don't have a choice, okay? You're not going to stop the government, okay? They'll take them, and they'll do so forcibly, or they'll put them in prison, okay? That's There is no, you just get to make the decision or you get to fight off Uncle Sam by yourself. Not going to happen, right? The biggest thing we're going to see is if you don't make decisions before the draft, and we'll get to that and how you actually avoid the draft, before the draft, it's pretty much too late, okay? So, no, you're not going to stop the government from drafting you or drafting your kids. What you're going to do about it, okay, there's some decisions you can make if they are drafted, but you won't be stopping them, okay? And the next obvious one is refusal to go, okay? Prison, right? Just understand, put people in jail and prison during Vietnam for dodging the draft, even conscientious objectors, even famous ones like Muhammad Ali. And they will do it again, okay? And that'll bring us into the next one. Oh, but first of all, and this is probably the most common comment I got is, I'll go to prison before I fight for a corrupt nation. Okay, like, you do you 100% have the right to do that. You can, go to prison and Diddy will be waiting for you in the showers. And you can spend the next however long the war is getting your cheeks clapped by Uncle Diddy, okay? If you think that's better than, serving in the military during the draft, good on you. But much like we saw in Vietnam, the vast majority of soldiers decided they'd rather just go to the military, okay? You're not that tough. You're not tougher than the people in prison. You're not going to have a great time. So, me personally, I would just take my risks on the battlefield, okay? War is a little bit more enjoyable, as bad as it is, than prison, okay? So, you do you, but vast majority of you, when push comes to shove and they show up at your house with handcuffs, you're going to decide to join the military. It is what it is. Now, the next one with that is, well, I'm not going to go to prison. I'll just flee to Canada, okay? Because a lot of people did flee to Canada during Vietnam, right? There's some nuance to that, okay? But why that's not going to work for you this time, and especially if the current administration stays in power, and this guy stays in power, okay, is that Canada and the United States have a joint extradition agreement. So, they will ship your happy ass back here, okay? During Vietnam, it was a little bit different because Canada obviously politically didn't agree with the war. This current administration and him will 100% ship your happy ass back here to the current administration, okay? You are not getting away from that one, all right? So fleeing to Canada is not a thing. Fleeing to Mexico, try that, probably not a thing either. Most likely, you'll get sent back. The reason why people were able to get away with it, so many people in the Vietnam War, is technology was different, okay? They can find you now. The U.S. government can find you anywhere on the planet. They couldn't in 1969. There was no cell phones. There was no tracking, right? You disappeared, you were gone. We live in a global society. They will find you, okay? So that's not a thing. Don't plan on that. If you think you're going to do that after you're drafted, you're hosed, okay? Next one, mental illness, right? Because in the era of Gen Z, they all have mental illnesses, apparently, which is, I saw this one all the time. I have anxiety, I have depression, I have autism, I have X, I have Y. In large-scale conflict, okay, we're looking at potentially the size of things like Ukraine, Russia, they're not going to care. They need bodies, right? So there will be waivers. Understand, there's the military can medically waive anything, and I mean anything it wants to, okay? I know this because once you're in the military, if you end up having some issue, and even in special forces, heart conditions or whatever, you can just get that shit waived to go to schools, stuff like that. So the government can waive whatever health condition it wants to if it needs to, okay? So don't plan on getting out of that because you've got a diagnosis for anxiety, right? Only really real physical issues are going to do that, right? You're missing a leg, you're paralyzed from the waist down, things like that, like major physical issues and deformities. Yeah, of course, they're not going to be able to draft you, but yeah, your basic ones, your bone spurs and things like that some of our rich politicians got away with in the past, that ain't going to happen in the future. And we'll talk about being the son of a rich politician here in a little bit. But the next one, and I saw this one so much. I'm 40 years old. I'm glad I'm 40 years old and I don't have to worry about being drafted. Or I'm 45, I don't have to worry about being drafted. Or I already served and now I got my DD 214 blanket. Guys, Ukraine is drafting all men up to the age of 60 years old to fight that war. That's the reality of it. Now, not to say that the first or upcoming draft would draft up to 60 years old, but as conflicts get worse and worse, they will expand who they're willing to draft because they need bodies. So 40 years old, yeah, you'd be highly capable. Still be able to fight at 40. Okay, so that's not one that is actually going to get you out of it. And this is my favorite one. As a misconception that people think it'll happen, that will never happen. And that is society, American society will revolt and the protests will be too large and people won't stand for it. People aren't gonna do jack shit, okay? COVID taught us that people will just roll over and die in America. And not only that, but if you haven't been paying attention to some of the videos I just did, America is silently taking steps to be able to quell and squash protests with violence, okay? So we've just given the federal government, Department of Defense intelligence components, the right to use lethal force against American citizens in defense of law enforcement departments or political uprisings, right? So that's the entire purpose. So what would that be great for? Oh, when you come out to try to do the first big protest against the draft, the federal government just shows up and wipes you off the street. Sorry, no more protests. That's how it works in all the other countries. Unfortunately, that's probably what it's looking like is probably going to turn out to be the reality in America if things don't change here in the near future, okay? So, again, right, you're not, like, this generation is not more proactive in protesting than the hippie generation was. It's not going to happen, right? Don't expect society's revolt to get you out of the draft. Right? The next, we need to get to the actual ways to avoid the draft. Okay, that's what everybody wants to know. Okay, and again, it is hyper important that you do any of these before the draft takes place. Once the draft takes place, your name is drafted, that's it. Like, you got some options. Go to prison, try to flee the country, not probably going to work. That's it. Or join the military and be drafted. Okay? How to do these? You got to do these beforehand. Okay? First one, and we just talked about it, and this is real, and you could do it. You leave the country and you renounce your citizenship. That's a reality. You have the right to do that. The problem is, and understand that that's permanent. Okay? So yes, that is what a lot of people did during Vietnam. And guess what? A lot of them never came back. Okay? The only reason any of them were allowed to come back and not just be immediately put in prison for it is because Jimmy Carter signed an amnesty bill that allowed them to come back in 1977. There is no guarantee that would happen again. Okay, so you get drafted, you dodge the draft, you leave the country. It's likely that's permanent. So if you're willing to do that, that's on you. That's a choice you can make. That's, I think, the obviously most extreme one, but you also have to pull it off before you're drafted. Okay, are you willing to take that risk? Most people aren't. Okay, because again, you never know if it's going to happen or it's not. Next one, and this one is, I think, and this was one in Vietnam, that I think is actually one that'll probably stand for a while, and that is be enrolled in college before you're drafted, okay? So there are academic exemptions that were in the last draft. There most likely will be in the next draft because America wants to keep its intellectuals, out of the war. Again, how much reality there is to that. But this one is, so if you're looking at it for your kids, right? And is this a time? Now, I don't necessarily think sending your kid to 4-year college straight at 18 when they don't know what they want to do is a great idea financially, but in the world we're looking at coming in the next 4 years, might not be a bad idea, okay? Again, you have to do this, and they have to be enrolled and in school before they get drafted to qualify for that exemption, okay? You can't get drafted and then be like, oh, I'm going to try to enroll in school. It ain't going to work that way, homie. All right? Again, but with that, this one's a temporary solution, okay? So this does not, let's say you're in college, you get your number drafted. This does not exempt you from the draft, okay? It's a deferment, which means in 4 years from now, if the war is still going, you are going to be drafted once you get out of school. Okay, so you're kind of just hoping at that point that the conflict ends before you have to actually get drafted. However, there's a different way, potentially, as we talk, towards the end, that you could leverage that. Okay. Yeah, next one, and this one's kind of luck of the draw, but it's a reality, and it's been this way in every draft for America, is be the son or daughter of a rich, powerful, or political, somebody in politics, right? Somebody rich, powerful in the business world. All right, the reality is their kids don't go fight the wars, right? You and I's kids go fight the wars, okay? So if you were lucky enough, then you're probably going to get out of it. Yay! Okay, but again, that one's not as great. Another one, have a real physical disability. We talked about it before. An actual disqualifying thing that you couldn't actually go serve. If you've got something like that, then you don't really have anything to worry about. Okay. And then now, this is going to be the final one, and I think it's actually the one that worked out the best in Vietnam, and that's why I'm going to put it as the one of the best choices, if not the best choice. And it's kind of super counterintuitive about avoiding the draft, and that is to enlist in the military. Okay, a lot of people think that's crazy. It's not. If you really think the draft is coming and you're 18 to 24 years old, the smartest thing you can do, and the smartest thing, my dad did it, is to enlist before you get drafted. Okay, the reason why is you get to pick your own career path forward, all right? You get to pick your job. You get to pick what you want to do. When you're drafted, needs of the Army, okay? What that means is they bring you in, whatever they decide you're going to go do, you're going to go do. Whether it's going to be in the trenches in the infantry, whether it's going to be a cook, you really don't have any choice in the matter. You enlist, you actually get to do that. So if you want to be in a safe place, one of the safest places to be during the draft is working in a non-combat MOS in the military, right? If you're an intel analyst or you're an engineer or supply sergeant, whatever, right? The likelihood of you seeing front lines of the war, it's non-existent for the most part. And also, you're not going to get drafted because you're already enlisted, okay? You're really rolling the dice by taking the chance of getting drafted instead of enlisting, right? So, yeah, it could potentially be, like I said, the safest place for you to actually be, which again is weirdly counterintuitive, right? One of the other things you could potentially do is if you're on deferment, a college education deferment when there is a draft, and it's potentially looking like the conflict will continue to escalate, you could potentially commission or do something like that and bypass it that way. So, yeah, you know, the interesting thing, I guess it's not really interesting, but the way the draft is really, the entire purpose of it and what it's used for makes it incredibly unlikely that you're going to be able to avoid it, right? Otherwise, why would they need the draft? Okay, so the whole point is to force people to join that wouldn't join otherwise. Okay, so I wish there was, you know, some better fail-safe ways for you to go about, you know, planning on avoiding the draft. But again, there are a few, like I mentioned here. But the reality is, like I said, if you wait to do any of these, and then you're drafted, your options become extremely low, which is accept the draft, go to prison, try to flee the country. 2 of the 3 of those are definitely not going to work out for you, which is prison and trying to flee the country. And, you know, the draft is what it is. You're going to go to war, just like a lot of us have done in the past. Okay, so, yeah, guys, you know, I hope, again, I'm wrong about this, but unfortunately, you know, even if history doesn't directly repeat itself, it definitely rhymes. And again, like I said, the draft is not the exception, it is the norm, and it is the norm around the world in pretty much every conflict that's ever existed. So you should not be shocked if we see it in the near future, because again, America loves going to war, okay? For those of you who think that America's never going to war again, you do not know how this country operates or how this system works. We will find one, okay? Whether it be through proxies or find another way to do enough saber rattling to get enough patriotism drummed up to get American boots on the ground as well, which is becoming increasingly looking more and more likely by the day with how the geopolitical landscape is shaping up. So, yeah, guys, again, we are going to have a much better ability to predict if this is going to happen about a week from today. So we'll see what happens when again, I think the world will change in one way or another for the rest of time after this election. It's going to be that big of an impact. So, yeah, guys, that'll do it for this one, and I will catch you in the next one.